My boyfriend doesn't know about the man in the basement. Pete and I have been dating for a few months now. If you've been reading the shit I've been through in the past year, you know that he's been by my side for some of the freakier things that have happened. He's been accepting and understanding, and we're doing so well. Your typical honeymoon phase, sharing our pasts, our secrets, telling no lies. Except for one, and that's entirely my fault. Pete doesn't know that I've been married. More specifically, Pete doesn't know that I was married, and that my ex-husband has been in my basement this entire time. I know what you're thinking, what kind of lifetime fuckery have I stumbled across? I promise it's a little different than you think. There's no dramatic cheating, no kidnapping scene, no twisted stalking or forced pregnancies. There's just two people who were very much in love until one of them wasn't. The one who wasn't was my ex-husband, Mark. He filed for divorce as suddenly as an unexpected storm passes. I was devastated for the longest time and tried really hard to rekindle our marriage. We got married young, after all. He was all I knew, all I had. When the divorce was final, he let me keep the house, a ranch style with a finished basement, and he moved out and moved on. He quickly started seeing someone he worked with, and by all accounts they looked really happy. That relationship lasted until Mark was killed in a drunk driving accident, a little over a year after our divorce. I guess I was still listed as his next of kin and his emergency contact. He had no other living family, and I was the one who was called to identify his body and make arrangements. I played nice with his girlfriend there for a while. She was so devastated, the poor thing. Almost as devastated as I was when he handed me the divorce papers. I let her have a hand in the arrangements, let her convince me he wanted to be cremated. Which was such bullshit. We had that talk 100 times, and he always wanted a proper burial. I let her handle all of the details with the crematorium. She made all of the phone calls, selected all of the dates, invited who she wanted to be there. I sat back and let her take the wheel. And then I took my ex-husband's body. I know. What the fuck? Look. We had not been divorced long enough for him to belong to anyone else but me. He didn't even properly express his final wishes with his new lover, so I had to take care of his arrangements. I didn't want to start a fuss or upset anybody. I suppose if you're assuming I had a bit of a mental breakdown, that you're right, just a little bit. Paying off the night guard at the crematorium was easy. Hauling his body in the back of the Outback and then into our once shared basement was easy. Laying down the plastic sheeting and purchasing a couple additions to Mark's old toolbox was easy. Cutting him up into manageable, freezable pieces was not. The idea had come to me in a dream after Mark's passing. I thought, why the hell didn't I deserve to have him with me always? I thought, why the hell should he burn when that's not what he wanted? I dreamt of sharing meals with him for at least another year, or however long a human body lasts another human. It may not be exactly what he wished, but I couldn't stomach the thought of him being chomped on by worms, or thrown to the wind never to be found again. So his body disappeared. They questioned everyone around him for a while, and let me tell you how thrilled I was that they questioned me the most. That meant he must have still thought about me, or brought me up. Why else would the cops think I was still in his life enough to even consider stealing his corpse? There were a few times his girlfriend got ballsy and drunk, calling me, accusing me of stealing him. I calmly asked her every time, why would I do that? She didn't have an answer to that. The cops didn't have an answer to that. I didn't entirely have an answer myself in the beginning. I mean, I stole his body because of the dream, but I didn't realize exactly what the dream meant for the longest time. After the initial day or two that I kept him in the deep freezer in our basement, I knew what I had to do. I could share meals with him for a long time, and also have a piece of him with me forever. It was simple enough. I had to ingest the entirety of my ex-husband. So I laid out the plastic and hacked him up. It took a lot more swings of the various tools I purchased to really separate his limbs into manageable pieces. I couldn't just Google this shit after all. That was always the first mistake of the guilty. I tried a meat cleaver, too messy, a hatchet, worked for the smaller extremities but not for the big shit, and finally garden shears, which surprisingly worked the best on his meaty frozen body. I removed his extremities first, and they were easy enough to hack off. All of the obviously human body parts were separated and put at the bottom of the freezer. Hands, feet, genitals and head were placed at the bottom. I ran into a few issues, the first being Mark's torso. In order for him to fit into the freezer, I had to get creative with my portions. If anyone ever peeked into the freezer, I didn't want them to know right away that there was a human body in there. So I had to hack below his ribs to reach the lower part of his spinal cord, which I had to use all of my strength to snap with the garden shears. Once I separated his organs into individual freezer bags, I ran into my next issue. You never realize how thick someone's sternum is until you're trying to snap in half with already dulled garden shears. Not wanting to risk another trip to Home Depot at this delicate time, I decided to go the old-fashioned route. If ancient peoples could create everlasting works of art using just a hammer and chisel, then why couldn't I? I slammed the end of my biggest paint edger with my sturdiest hammer into the center of Mark's sternum and finally heard the satisfying crack I needed to know I had separated one of the tougher bones in the human body. My final challenge, and definitely the hardest one, was separating Mark's hips from the rest of his body. There wasn't much meat on them and they were so obviously human I couldn't risk keeping them around. The hips are complicated. Their lower half is surrounded by muscle protecting the femur and the rest of the hip is tough bone and a tight ball and socket. Hacking through the cartilage there was the only part of the process that made me nauseous, especially with my limited tools. Only when I had destroyed the cartilage protecting the ball and socket was I able to rip and twist the femur from the hip joint. This took up most of my day and a lot of my strength as well. I spent a lot more time shaving down and shattering the obviously human's bones that I couldn't risk keep around. This meant I couldn't keep Mark's head. I saved that task for last and spent a few hours staring longingly at his chubby cheeks and his bright blue eyes, faded to a milky gray, before flaying the skin from his cheeks and prying his skull open. I had a plan. I wanted to save Mark's brain for our last meal together. His heart for the second to last. Maybe when I had eaten all of him that I deemed safe to eat could I understand why he had ended our marriage. Maybe when I had ingested all of Mark could I know his last thoughts and wishes, hopes and dreams. I teared up over that thought as I sliced the thin membrane from his brain and proceeded to scrape the brain from his skull. This long after his death I had to basically remove his brain like one would scrape the wet lining from a pumpkin before one carved it. Eventually I had his brain in my hands though, and I hoisted it gently into its own freezer bag and buried it under the rest of his meat. I had to wait a few days before I started dining with Mark though, because the cops were sniffing around and that drunk bitch of a girlfriend was calling me every night to harass me. During my wait, I met Pete. It was unfortunate timing. I had healing to do from my past and plans for my future that possibly included this cute new guy. He was sweet and easy to talk to. Our relationship quickly grew more and more serious. When we weren't spending time together and when I had finally convinced at least the police that I had nothing to do with Mark's body disappearing did I finally get to share my first meal with Mark. I figured I'd start with the meatiest parts. Mark's calves, thighs and upper arms lasted me maybe 2 weeks. I was definitely under the impression that we'd have a year or more together, but his body went quickly. His glutes and his stomach lasted me only a few more meals. With the many meals with Mark I quickly became more accustomed to the taste of human meat than any other kind. I started eating only vegetables and fruits in front of Pete. I figured I wasn't getting the right kind of protein from Mark, as I was constantly feeling weak and sick to my stomach. When I started eating more vegetables and fruits, I felt a little better, but not 100%. Pete assumed almost immediately that I was a vegetarian, and I didn't correct him. I guess that is another lie I've kept in a way, by omission. Believing I was a vegetarian worked in my favor though. Pete didn't even know there was a deep freezer in the basement. When I first, cautiously, allowed him in my home, I told him the basement was an unfinished cold slab of cement just big enough to fit a washer and dryer. As much as I liked Pete, I refused to let him stay over very often so he never needed to do laundry. I'm almost positive Pete has never gone down to my basement, meaning he has never been anywhere near Mark, something I'm very happy about. My dilemma now is not whether or not to come clean to Pete. I think I'm in too deep to tell him about my biggest secret, plus we haven't dated long enough for me to know for sure he wouldn't run crying to the police. My dilemma now is simply how to finish Mark off. Pete has been coming over more and more often, sometimes entirely unannounced. Once he came over when I was making a stew of Mark's forearms and pecs. With all of these close calls, I had to decide whether to end things with Pete so I could enjoy a completely uninterrupted night with Mark's brain, or draw some better boundaries with Pete so I didn't have to worry about Pete busting me, but still enjoy my relationship with him. Have my brain and eat it too, you could say. I eventually decided to keep Pete around. I would eat Mark's brain a little bit at a time. Besides, I had seen all of the horror movies and documentaries. Eating a human brain all at once was bad news. And eating Mark's heart hadn't given me any mystical and romantic answers like I thought it would. I had only the brain left after barely a few months feasting on my ex's flesh. I had underestimated how long we'd have. The effects of eating Mark's most precious organ came on pretty quickly. I had been sick for months, but I definitely felt the difference after only 3 or 4 large tastes of his brain. Whenever I tried to hold Pete's hand, I shook violently. I was cold constantly, feverish, almost. I was racked with headaches and the fevers caused joint pain. Pete was so sweet throughout the entire thing. He asked constantly how I was feeling, brought me soups and breads and soft pillows, took my temperature for me. He offered continuously to take me to doctors, but I claimed over and over again that I had gone to them already and they just hadn't found any sickness. Another lie to add to the growing pile, I suppose. I had a few moments when I thought I should stop, yes. When I thought maybe if I didn't take another bite of Mark then I could have this whole other life with Pete. We were doing so well, after all. And even though I was sick, and work was stressing me out, what with the hauntings and the death of friends, and my family asking why I was falling over all the time, I thought we had a real shot at happiness. I finished off Mark's brain like a fat kid finishes off forbidden cake, though. The effects of that were immediate. Now not only could I barely speak or walk, I also couldn't swallow, keep my emotions in check, or catch something to save my life. I was losing weight rapidly and I kept calling off of work. I canceled plans with Pete, plans that sounded so fun, plans that he made with such enthusiasm, plans I would have enjoyed. I was slowly dying within my own house, a house I shared with someone who was long gone and didn't love me anymore, instead of living life with a man who was probably falling in love with me. I wish I could take it all back, I do. I wish I would have called Pete and asked for help, made up some bullshit just to see him one more time. But my hands weren't working well enough to accept any calls, and every time I stretched my arm out to text him I saw more and more lesions seeping pus developing on my skin. There was no way I wanted Pete to see me like that. Instead of answering his messages, I dedicated what time I had left to document what I had done. I saw so many texts pop up from Pete asking why I was blowing him off out of absolutely nowhere. I wish I could have explained it all to him. Where are you? How are you? Are you sick? Food poisoning? I could bring you something. I might have suspected food poisoning, too. I was too out of it to tell him he was close, but not quite there. I was too out of it to tell him to come over or call 911. I was too out of it to tell him I regret quite a few things I had done in the past month. I heard my phone going off, but it was like trying to listen to something on the shore while deep underwater. Everything was muffled and my eyes wouldn't focus, my voice wouldn't work. I felt awful and all I wanted was to call for help. Instead my weak form remained in its exact position, curled on the couch in the fetal position, my hands dipped in my own puke, my back arched away from my own excrement. My skin was blistering and splitting open at a rapid rate. It was horrifying and painful. There's no cure for the neurodegenerative disease that is killing me faster and faster by the hour. Pete stopped texting a few days ago. I guess he gave up on me. I guess I don't blame him. I am going to die, in a few days or a week, and Mark will die with me. This wasn't worth it. I didn't even learn why he left me when I ate that final bit of brain.